To me, I think we can all agree that the goal is to create more sustainability in our mobility choices. So it's really just about doing it, actually acting on it. We all are experts at finding the roadblocks and complications. Talking about before with charging infrastructure, parking, these are solvable because there are so many great examples of it. So it's really acting. And I think we all here, we are biased towards shared mobility and sustainable mobility. So we all have an obligation of spreading that word and sharing the experiences that we have to impact.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, dear panelists. Thank you all for listening. And yeah, have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone. Oh, hello. Hello. All right. We will move things right along as in very good Wunder style, or maybe it's from my Belize style. We are not on time, so we'll keep on going. I will present the next panel, Using Data to Improve Operations, and we have Michael Lee, our Chief Product and Technology Officer, leading this panel. Michael?
Thank you. Thanks, Amber. Thank you. Who knows me, I'm a very punctual person. Everybody knows that in the company. I'm always on time, and now I'm 25 minutes late, so apologies for that. I will promise, or I'm promising that the next 30 minutes are not going to be a geek talk. We are talking about how data can be utilized by operators and how they can benefit of it. And for that, we have a great panel with fantastic guests. First of all, I'd like to introduce Felix Jacobsen from Zoba, one of our marketplace partners. Felix, welcome on stage. Second of all, we have Jonas Seyfferth from Strategy End. And last but not least, it's Thibault, co-founder and CEO from Vianova. Gentlemen, can you introduce yourself quickly? Who are you? What are you doing?
I'm Jonas Seyfferth, Director with Strategy End. I drive very much for PwC and Strategy End, the mobility transformation in our firm, but also for many of our clients, be it in the corporate space or in the public space, and personally focus particularly on developing new business models, new services driven by data. And I'm really excited being here tonight, or this morning.
I'm Felix. You said we shouldn't make it a geek talk. Still, Zoba, I would say, is a bunch of geeks. So basically what we do is we try to take any operator's data and automate operational day-to-day decisions in order to drive up utilization through machine learning models.
And hi, everyone. I'm Thibault. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vianova. In short, we are the leading mobility intelligence platform in Europe. So we basically act as a trusted third party to do data exchange between operators and cities, and provide data analytics for purposes such as urban planning, policy making, or demand forecasting. Very happy to be here.
Thank you very much. I think 3-4 years ago, maybe 5, we would sit here together and talk about data as the new gold and be excited about it. Today, we see that we are actually surrounded by data, but we are starving for insights. And I would really like to know from you what you think about it. Maybe Felix, you first. How can we make sure that operators are not drowning in data, but they can actually generate insights out of it?
I think we need to look at data from 2 different time frames. So on the one hand, we have monthly data, weekly data, certain KPIs that we follow in order to inform strategic or tactical decisions. And I think this is something that the human mind can very much grasp based on smart analysis. I think in day-to-day, if I consider a mobility system, let's say 2,000 vehicles, 4 rides per day per vehicle, that's 8,000 interventions into a supply system. How are you, as a human, going to make sense of that? So in my eyes, I think we should leave that part actually to algorithms and machines in order to understand and generate those insights and the decisions. And I think then, as soon as we get away from the heat maps, I think it's getting a lot better.
Jonas, what do you think? How is it possible that we're actually not drowning in all this data and not just collecting, but collecting it for a sense?
Yeah, I believe you need to align it very, very much with your strategy and your intent of what you want to achieve as an organization. And depending on where you're coming from, if you are a public organization or a vehicle manufacturer or an operator, you have very different targets and KPIs by which you are measured in the past. So first, getting an understanding of where do you want to go in terms of do you want to grow new business? Is everything about innovation and building new services, even thinking about selling data? Or is it more about improving your products you have in the market already and then improve the customer engagement cycle from marketing and targeting to driving up conversations and conversions to increasing loyalty? Or is it about more driving down cost? And depending on where you decide as a CEO or a board on where your emphasis is, you need then to think about what are data-driven use cases and applications which allow you to reach these targets. And only then in a third step, you start thinking actually about the data in terms of what data do you need, where to get it from, and how to derive the insights that Felix just mentioned.
Thank you. Thibault, you were working with cities, and I guess they would actually love to get every single data that they can get to make decisions. But what's your experience about the sheer amount of data and how you can actually control the sheer amount and get insights out of it?
So first of all, basically, at least all the cities that we work with, generally when we start a project, there is a list of use cases that are the basis basically of GDPR compliance. So if you want to share basically data, and especially like indirect personal data, which are GPS located data sets, you need to have a list of use cases that can actually justify the purpose of the collection and processing of this data. So based actually on these use cases that are very interesting also to share for operators for transparency reasons, you can actually create the insights that you need. And again, these insights, and I think Tina earlier and Karen was talking about that, those insights actually are very interesting to create smart policies and smart regulations. If you actually want to, for instance, like curb wild parking in cities, which is basically the main topic, then you need insights on, where are basically the most, the hotspots for parking, where are potentially parking bays that you could repurpose into like mobility hubs for micromobility. If you want to actually bring safer roads for vulnerable road users, cyclists, and so on, you need to understand what are the most used road axes in a city to build cycling lanes. So those actually insights help actually both the city into making better policies and better urban planning decisions, but also as an operator make actually a lot of sense in terms of operations, because you want to make sure that the cities understand your business. You want to make sure that the cities can actually take the right decisions on what are the constraints as you as an operator to make sure that yes, you are constrained by the public space and all these different users, but you can actually help the cities making those steps to take the right decisions and help drive your sustainable mobility business. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for sharing. Product and engineering at Wunder, we usually focus on two main elements for the operators that we are serving. It's increasing their revenue, so everything that we want to do is increasing the revenue of our operators, and at the same time also help them reduce the OPEX, so reduce the cost. Jonas, how can data help with this to increase revenue for operators to decrease the cost?
Yeah, as said earlier, it depends on where you are in an operator in your overall growth story as a company, right? So if you're still in an early stage where you are about to select and decide in which cities you want to launch, you can use data to improve your market intelligence to take an informed decision about where is the highest market potential in terms of citizen acceptance for this type of mobility. Understand very precisely what's the average household income, what's the willingness to pay, very detailed information about the competitors, how much discount they're giving. We just had over dinner yesterday the discussion that there are companies who read through inboxes, email inboxes of users once they're consented that they allow that, and to scan basically payments and discounts on their credit card, payments to scooter operators. So you can then, as an operator, if you buy into this intelligence, have a very good understanding which city to which price point you want to start. Now, of course, this then saves you a lot of money or accelerates your growth story if you take the right decisions on these cities. Now, once you are in the cities, it's much more about driving up utilization. And here again, you can use data to understand better where the highest demand is, where your competitors are located in the cities, and then engage with cities to discuss about I call it the operating driving domain, to discuss with them actually where are you allowed to use your scooters, and give also the cities some arguments, even internally in their debates, about how does that specific scooter and that specific fleet in that specific area is paying into the overall city mayor mobility agenda. So once you get this into shape, you have a second big driver for growth. Now, in terms of cost, one last point is then that you can, of course, if you get much better understanding of how your assets are utilized and everything, information about life cycle management of your individual scooter asset, you can benchmark it against competitor data, you can benchmark it internally in your fleets, and you can then derive also from that lessons learned, practical guidance on how to drive down cost in the maintenance part, up to the point on what's the perfect timing of potentially also reselling or changing the OEM who's providing the vehicle to further drive down cost.
Sounds like a long list, Felix. Right? I mean, you're helping operators to actually increase revenue, decrease costs. So what is the starting point? So where would you start? Because that sounds like a 3-year project, to be honest, but where would you start?
So we look at about a month of past historical data and infer everything from that. And we're always astonished whenever we start working with a new operator and with new markets, and by now we're in over 150 markets, how mobility operators actually don't make a lot of use of their data. So how does it work? In the morning, they see, oh, this vehicle has been idle for a week or for 2 days, and this seemed to work yesterday. Okay, let's place some here. And what does that result in? Yesterday morning, I arrived at Hamburg train station. 7:45 a.m., I saw 50 scooters outside. At 5 p.m., there was still 45. So it was a massive oversupply, because our human intuition tells us, okay, the vehicle goes where it's quickly driven away from. However, oversupplying ultimately means that you waste capacity in other areas. So we would look at past trip data, calculate the network in order to understand all the conditional ride probabilities that the users do in the network, and then understand what is undersupplied. So we try to actually place a scooter, a car, a moped, an e-bike, whatever it may be, at a location where it will be driven to the train station, so that then again it's going to be driven away from that. And that usually is just something that our minds cannot do, which is why we believe technology is needed for that.
And how much do you take into account third-party information, like events, weather conditions, things like this?
We only look at weather condition. So we work with, I think they just rebranded from Climacell into tomorrow.io. And that's the only external source. Apart from that, events, for instance, I always take the example of a football stadium. Let's say, okay, all of a sudden you have all your vehicles go out there, but then what happens afterwards? Everyone's had 2 or 3 beers, they don't drive the vehicles back, you need to move them again. So while it has an impact on your overall demand, it does not necessarily optimize your utilization pattern. And utilization patterns in a mobility network are really like, it's like a breathing lung. Vehicles move in, they move out, and you need to find the small imbalances in order to balance those out. Again, 2,000 vehicles, 4 trips per day, that's 8,000 interventions. Even if you're to move 400 vehicles every day, that's 5% of the interventions. You cannot make a huge difference in that they'll be driven exactly then, but you need to balance out the imbalances in the system. And that's, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thibault, what you think is a good way to reduce cost? Because, I mean, utilization is about revenue, but what about cost?
So just to come back on what Felix said, I'm actually always like, there's a lot of startups, they should be actually software first startups. They have like, I would say like a non-legacy IT, but still like, I feel like they're so much drawn into operations that they don't have time to look at data. you know. And as Vianova, like we work with both parties, and when we provide our operator dashboard, they're always amazed by looking at the insight that they can get on, like, again, like idle vehicles, you know, like demand, OD metrics, seeing where their hotspots are, and so on. So in terms of like data usage, I see basically 3 steps. The first one is really like the steps at the beginning when you actually have to choose your market and see like how do you actually address your market. So that's pre-deployment. And you know, that's when you actually potentially have like competitive data, like have like movement data to understand like, you know, how do you actually address a new market, what's the purchasing power of this market, and so on, like what's the use of transportation there. You have like, once you enter the market, which is like, again, like how do you actually optimize your fleet in terms of placement, but also like optimize your maintenance and battery swapping, which is just the now. And then you have the future, which is how do you actually utilize the data so then you can actually stay in the city for long term and the market can grow. What does that mean? It means, again, what we see is that in cities where it works the best in terms of vehicle utilization is that when there is existing infrastructure for these vehicles. We all know like the problems of like car sharing that actually don't have a parking spots, and you have to go around, you know, to actually find a parking spot because there is no dedicated parking spot for car sharing. And like a lot of like these operators are actually exiting these kind of markets. So you need actually, that's why you also need to have like long-term planning with the city, long-term commitment with the city, so that actually the policies that they're taking, they take these shared mobility operators as part of their sustainable mobility plan, and they actually potentially could even subsidize those ones at some point, whether this is, you know, like direct trip subsidies, etc. But those ones are also important data usage in the long term, so that as a mobility operator, you're there to establish a real collaboration in the long term with this city, expand the market. I give you an example, for instance, like we work with Voy and Northamptonshire. What we see is that like starting with them, like we were at like 200 like e-scooters in the city. Like after 6 months, it was more than 1,000 e-scooters. The complaints were completely flat. Even though basically like the number of vehicles was times 5, they managed to go from Northampton to the whole county while actually keeping the complaints the same way. And we heard before, like from Hamburg, that they're receiving so many complaints from citizens. Why? Because potentially like they don't have this communication channel, which, you know, somehow enabled partly by Vianova, because you can actually have this direct notification between cities and operators, but also like having this like intelligent policy so that, you know, you have that direct communication feedback, and again, like cities feel in control about widening the actual operational zones, but also like increasing the fleet size. Yeah.
One question where I think, I mean, usually you have almost the same opinion about data, but there's one thing that we detected in the beginning that you might have a controversial opinion, is sharing data. While we are like to share vehicles and assets, at the same time sharing data, and not only using for your own purposes, but for example, sharing it via platform, sharing it with cities. How is your experience in that? So I think that you guys are rather focusing on allowing the operators to use their own data to their own advantage, while you are pretty much also in the platform business to looking that people contribute the data so that you have broader insights, which is also the strategy that you mentioned. What's your opinion there? It's rather keep it for yourself in the beginning to generate an advantage and later share it, or share it from the beginning to enable all operators to get better?
I think, again, we're looking at 2 different levels of data. I think on an everyday level, the data you need to inform your tactical decisions of what you're going to do every day, that data doesn't need to be shared. Also, I mean, what's the city going to do with all that data that they get all the time? Again, they're just going to drown in it. I think in terms of actual understanding long-term demand patterns, certain commuter behavior, these sort of things, I think those should be shared, because ultimately it's all about elevating the overall sharing ecosystem. And I think that's fine.
I believe data sharing, I mean, data sharing doesn't, your question implied like sharing data means you give away the data for free, right? And I think we need to be a bit more precise in terms of under which condition do you actually share the data. And there is certain, and we discussed that, I believe, earlier around open data, where the EU government says, from a regulatory point of view, there is certain information which needs to be made available for free. But then there is also information which just needs to be, and for everyone, and then there needs to be information made available only to the authorities or to other parties under certain conditions. And I believe establishing an infrastructure, standards, APIs, which allow parties to facilitate this cross-organizational data sharing is key and it's fundamental. It's also something here which the EU is driving. In Germany, actually just, I believe today at ITS, the mobility data space is officially launched, which provides a decentral sharing network for data. And I do believe that this is a first crucial step. Now, the second step is then to educate the potential consumers on what to do with the data, right? And here I believe they're just making it available like a shopping window of data, I think somebody once said, is a good step to get a bit inspired. But then you need to have the community collaboration initiatives and also individual marketplaces like Vianova, who then give the potential consumers some inspiration of what to do with the data, try to develop some use cases and applications, and then get basically the sharing wheel spinning.
So yeah, just what I would add, I think, is data sharing with control. So that's also like one of the great things about exchange platform or marketplace is that you can actually then completely monitor who you're sharing data with, having like the legal contracts attached to every feed that you're sharing data for. You can like basically change your conditions, whether this is actually free sharing for regulatory purpose with cities, whether this is open data, whether this is data that you want to monetize. And again, like, why would you actually share data? You want to share data with cities because that helps you basically getting better policies, getting better infrastructure, so like long-term possibilities, long-term like business for you. You can share it with software providers like Zoba that actually can improve like your feed utilization. You can share it with mass platform that actually you can drive like customers from the mass platform from a PTO back to your operations. You can actually share it with charging operators that like enable you actually to have better place charging operator for your vehicles. So the whole thing about making sure that you have this data platform help you like in one go actually like having one legal agreement, one standardized API, no more like ad hoc requests from like different parties, one GDPR compliant third party, security of your data, all in one go. So that has a lot of advantages for the market, for the industry.
I'd be interested to understand, Thibault, actually. You work a lot with cities and operators. Do you actually realize that cities implement a lot of better policies based on the data? Do they make use of it? The majority of cities?
The majority of cities, then it's an education that you have to provide. Yeah. And it goes also from the operator side. It's kind of like, from the operator side, at the beginning, it was kind of like rogue deployment. And rogue deployment, what does it mean, rogue deployment? It means that, for instance, in Paris, you had 25,000 vehicles back in 2018, and then there was no cities in France allowing e-scooters anymore. So it kind of like delayed the market for 2 years. And then on the back of that, then, like all these shared mobility operators were like, oh, shit, sorry, we can't go to France anymore because all the city officials don't want to like get accepted e-scooters, So what they do, examples, for instance, Stockholm, 27,000 e-scooters. We work with mobility operators to build 100 mobility hubs. At some point, election time in Stockholm, Green Party, Right Party, they were thinking, what should we do about the e-scooters? There's so many complaints, we have to do something about it. Let's create parking hubs so that at least we can improve basically like sidewalk cluttering and so on. Bruxelles, creating cycling lanes on the cycling lanes, the Corona lanes that were built in 2020 post first lockdown, times 5 traffic of micromobility vehicles, thanks to these new cycling lanes that were built. Thanks to data shared from the operators to the city, that brings basically like more utilization for operators, because again, like citizens feel more comfortable riding on these shared micromobility vehicles.
Because I mean, the interesting thing that I often see is somehow in the markets is that actually cities don't come up necessarily with the super smart strategies. If I look at a tender such as in Barcelona, where all of a sudden you have 16 moped sharing operators, of which only 5 are going to deploy and 2 are a scam, or in Oslo right now, where you had actually someone like Voy who had thousands of vehicles and 7, 8, 9 trips per day, and all of a sudden you have 900 vehicles per operator for 8 operators or 9 operators for 6 months as a pilot period over the winter, I mean, who's going to invest in that? You know, and how is it about elevating? And then the question is, do I give my data away for free? Or do I actually enter in some sort of agreement with the city to say, okay, let's actually elevate our mobility system because we need to get away from private car ownership? And there I feel, at least from what I see in the market, not necessarily the willingness so much from city. That's why I'm curious to hear.
Don't forget that
your 2 opinions.
they come from like traffic management background about cars, you know. So now they have to move into mobility management.
Yeah.
And the people inside the city don't have a mobility management skills or background, you know. So they have to learn. Similarly, like as a mobility operator, like, you know, startup person, you come, you're very excited, like you want to deploy like in every city, and you have to understand like what's the agenda of the city I'm deploying my.
No, but I mean, Paris is a great example. I mean, Paris, like the political will is there, and the city has changed massively over the past few years. It's just like grown so much in quality of life. It's impeccable.
Yeah,
and I think mobility is one of the big parts of it.
Yeah, I believe, I mean, you're right. At the end, you know, every city has a different trajectory on how quickly they adapt to this new mobility. But I found interesting still is urban planning is one of the few markets where you have actually complete transparency from a city perspective. If you look at global best practices, you can easily just travel to the other city and you can look around yourself how the mobility is there. But despite that, cities very, very slowly change, right? And if you look at all the great example of bicycle-driven cities in Northern Europe, and I had conversations more with the US mayors who fly there, they're astonished, and then they come back, but nothing really changed. And they flew there already 10 years ago, right? But I believe what is changing now is indeed that there is some pressure also within their cities from their younger inhabitants, because they see to improve quality of life, to attract talent in their city, who ultimately pay taxes in their city, they need to adapt. Unfortunately, this just goes very slowly because, you know, only every year so and so many new people are moving into a city. But I believe in the end game, all the cities will have integrated mobility planning because otherwise nobody wants to live in these cities anymore.
So later we have lunch break and coffee breaks, and I was wondering, what is a trend that you see in handling data in the entire, in your industry, in your the topics that you're handling, where you see something coming in the future that is worth to discuss over a lunch break, or that somebody should be aware of? Is there something on the horizon that you see that's coming where we should actually be aware of today?
Well, first I would like to, I think, congratulate like all the shared mobility operators for working so closely with cities. Because even though we're saying, hey, they don't want to share data, or there was like, you know, a lot of rock deployments at the beginning, what the car manufacturing haven't done for the last 100 years, shared mobility has done it in 2 years. So they work collaboratively with cities. And my question would be like, what about data sharing for OEMs? Should cars actually, and we discussed that earlier, should actually cars, you know, like also like share data to the public sector to actually improve traffic, to improve parking. And again, we discussed that regulation enforcement over speed, regulation enforcement about parking. 100% of the cars will be connected by 2024. Should we actually set up like speed limit for cars? 30 km per hour in cities, you cannot go above 30 km per hour. Yes, if you look at Paris, I think it's between 100 to 140% pedestrian and cyclist accidents for the last increase for the last 12 months. You know, mostly actually like against cars. So, you know, there is a lot to do also like to make sure that this regulation enforcement move from the pure like you know, shared mobility to actually the bigger chunk, which was called the elephant in the room, cars, so that, you know, we actually have this digital enforcement happening.
Thank you.
I have two ideas for lunch. One is all about cybersecurity. Once fleets are operated remotely and you can enforce almost live if you can park a vehicle there and also a car, and also can enforce that you are unable to lock the car because you're parking in a parking spot. You know, what type of risk does that expose a city towards intruders from other countries? And second one, I just got a client request from an Asian country who's looking into quantum computer opportunities in transportation. And I was amazed. They want to invest quite a bit of money there, and they're now screening the European markets for first application areas for quantum computing over the next 5 years and spend real money there now. So what would be your cases of quantum computing in transport logistics?
Thank you.
I'd like to take it back to the panel topic, using data to improve your operations. And I think a lot of the operators realize now all of a sudden, okay, there's a lot of competition, there's a lot happening, and what's my key to profitability? It's my operations. At the end of the day, car sharing, scooter sharing, whatever it is, it's a game of operational excellence, to a certain extent branding, let's say also customer loyalty, of course, pricing innovation. And I think pricing innovation and operations innovation in terms of how to increase the utilization are going to be the two biggest topics for the next year in order to actually move all those shared schemes towards profitability.
Thank you. And one last question, one sentence answer, maybe looking at the time. When we leave the room later on, and we would like to really tackle this entire data topic, going from data-informed to data-led, what should I do? One sentence. What is it after we leave this room? What is the first thing I should do?
Let's chat.
Again, get clarity of what you want to achieve in your strategy and how to think about how to improve the strategic choices using data, and imagine you had this data available and then think about how to get it. Yeah.
And I would say like data-driven collaboration and come to Vianova if you want to collaborate with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for not making it a geek talk and sharing the insights. Thank you very much for being here. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Michael. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are almost to the lunch break, but we do have one more panel coming up, and they will be talking about navigating new markets. We have our Chief Revenue Officer, Corey Schmidt, who would be leading the next panel.
Hi, everyone. So launching and scaling a fleet in a familiar territory is one thing, but as many of you know, navigating and thriving in new markets is another. And what's true for one city in one country might not be true for the next. So how can you ensure success when expanding your operations? With me to discuss